The small reconnaissance ship tumbled through the void of space like a broken bird. Its engines dead, and its hull scarred by plasma burns that still glowed orange against the darkness. Commander Alira Vance pulled herself from the wreckage of her pilot's seat, blood running down her forehead and her left arm, hanging at an angle that told her it was broken. She had been alone on this mission. A simple scouting run through the outer territories, where human colonies had been disappearing without explanation. Now she understood why. Through the cracked viewport of her dying ship, she could see the massive vessel that had ambushed her. And it was unlike anything in the human fleet database. The ship was black and organic looking, covered in what appeared to be scales or perhaps chitin, and it moved through space with a grace that seemed almost alive. Alira reached for her emergency beacon with her good hand, but before she could activate it, a blinding light filled her cockpit and she felt her body being pulled upward through the metal ceiling, as if the ship itself had become liquid around her. When her vision cleared, she found herself lying on a cold floor that seemed to pulse beneath her like a heartbeat. The air smelled wrong, thick with something chemical and sweet that made her stomach turn. She tried to stand, but her broken arm screamed in protest and she fell back to her knees. That was when she saw them for the first time. The Vethkai stood in a circle around her, their bodies tall and thin like insects stretched to human height. Their skin was the color of dried blood, and their faces held no expression she could read, because they had no faces as humans would understand them. Instead, they had clusters of small black eyes arranged in patterns across smooth skulls, and their mouths were vertical slits filled with needle-thin teeth. One of them stepped forward, and Alira noticed it wore something like a robe made of materials that shimmered with colors. She had no names, for this one was taller than the others and moved with an authority that marked it as their leader. "The specimen is damaged," it said in a voice that sounded like metal scraping against metal. And Alira realized with horror that it was speaking directly into her mind rather than through the air. "We will repair it before we begin." Alira tried to speak, to demand answers, or perhaps to threaten them with the wrath of the human fleet. But her voice came out as nothing more than a croak. The tall one tilted its head at an angle that no human neck could achieve. "I am lead researcher Skethrix." The voice invaded her thoughts again. "And you are the first human we have captured alive. What do you want?" Alira managed to whisper, "Knowledge," Skethrix replied. And something in the way it said the word made Alira's blood run cold. "We study species, we learn their limits. We understand their weaknesses. And this process requires pain." Alira was lifted by invisible forces and carried through corridors that twisted in ways that hurt her eyes to follow. The walls were lined with tanks filled with murky liquid, and she tried not to look too closely at the shapes floating inside them. Some of them were still moving. They brought her to a chamber at the heart of the ship, a room filled with instruments that gleamed under harsh white lights. The tools on the tables looked surgical, but there was something cruel in their design. Curves and edges that served no medical purpose she could imagine. "Your species is unremarkable," Skethrix observed as other Vethkai strapped Alira to a table that adjusted itself to hold her completely immobile. "No natural armor, no venom, no regenerative abilities, average strength and speed. We had hoped for more from the beings who have spread across so many worlds. We have ships," Alira said through gritted teeth as the restraints tightened. "We have weapons. We will come for me. They will not find you," Skethrix replied with what might have been amusement. "And even if they did, you would be long dead. But do not worry. Your death will serve the advancement of knowledge." The first hours were the worst because Alira still had hope. She believed that she could endure, that she could outlast them, that somehow she would find a way to escape or be rescued. The Vethkai worked on her with clinical precision, taking notes on her reactions to each new form of agony they introduced. They seemed genuinely curious about how much she could take, adjusting their methods based on her responses. Like scientists fine-tuning an experiment, Skethrix watched everything with those clusters of black eyes, occasionally leaning close to examine her face as she screamed, "Fascinating," it would say. "Your species continues to function far longer than our models predicted. The will to survive is strong in you." Alira stopped speaking after the 6th hour. She stopped screaming after the 10th. By the 15th hour, she had retreated to a place deep inside herself where the pain was just noise, a distant storm that could not touch the core of who she was. The Vethkai increased their efforts. Seemingly frustrated by her silence, they wanted data, they wanted reactions, and her quiet defiance was ruining their carefully designed protocols. "Tell us about your fleet positions," Skethrix demanded, its mental voice carrying an edge of irritation. "Cooperation will end your suffering." Alira looked up at the creature with eyes that had gone hollow and empty. "Go to hell," she whispered. The next phase of experimentation began. Alira felt her body starting to fail. Systems shutting down one by one, like lights going out in an abandoned building. Her heart was struggling, each beat weaker than the last. And she could feel something warm and final spreading through her chest. The monitors around her began to wail with alarms that the Vethkai silenced. With quick gestures, "The specimen is entering terminal failure," one of the researchers reported. Skethrix moved closer, watching with those dead black eyes as the last of Alira's strength faded. "Record the exact moment," it ordered. "We will need precise data for the autopsy." Alira's last thought was of Earth, of blue skies she had not seen since childhood, of her mother's voice singing songs she could no longer remember the words to. Then there was nothing but darkness and silence, and an end to all the pain. The monitors flatlined with a long, steady tone. "Time of death recorded," a researcher announced. 17 hours, 43 minutes from capture. Impressive endurance for such a physically unremarkable species. Skethrix turned away from the table, already losing interest in the broken body that lay there. "Prepare the remains for biological recycling," it ordered. "And prepare the holding cells. Our scouts report another human ship entering the sector. Perhaps the next specimen will provide more useful data." The researchers began to disconnect the monitoring equipment, unstrapping the restraints from limbs that would never move. Again, no one noticed the faint golden light that flickered briefly behind Alira's closed eyelids. No one was watching 37 minutes later when her dead heart suddenly beat once, then twice, then settled into a steady rhythm that grew stronger with each passing second. No one was prepared for what came next. The specimen disposal wing of the Vethkai research station was cold and quiet, a place where dead things were taken to be processed into useful components. A low-ranking technician named Crixville worked alone in the recycling chamber. Preparing the human body for biological breakdown, it was tedious work. But Crixville did not mind the solitude. The dead did not complain or make demands. The human female lay on a metal slab, her body covered in wounds that told the story of her final horse. Crixville had seen many specimens come through this room, beings from dozens of worlds who'd all ended up the same way, reduced to raw materials for the Dominion's endless hunger for resources. This one looked no different from the others. Crixville activated the scanner to catalog the body's remaining useful compounds. And that was when the first alarm triggered. The technician froze, certain there had been some malfunction in the equipment. The scanner was showing biological activity, but that was impossible because the specimen had been dead for 37 minutes and the Vethkai did not make mistakes about such things. Then, Human's chest rose with a sharp intake of breath. Vel stumbled backward, knocking over a tray of surgical tools that clattered across the floor with sounds that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet room. The human's eyes snapped open, and for a moment they stared at nothing, empty and confused, like someone waking from a dream they could not remember. Then awareness flooded back into them, and with it came something that Crixville had never seen in the eyes of any specimen before: rage. The human sat up on the slab, her movements jerky and uncoordinated, but growing stronger with each passing second. She looked down at her own body, at the wounds that still marked her skin. And then she looked at Crixville with an expression that made the technician's blood turn to ice. "Where am I?" the human asked, her voice rough and raw from screaming. Crixville did not answer because Crixville was already running for the emergency alarm on the far wall. The technician never made it. Hilera did not remember deciding to move, did not remember crossing the distance between the slab and the fleeing alien. But suddenly she was there, and her hands were around its throat, and she was squeezing. With strength she had not known she possessed. The technician collapsed to the floor, and Hilera stood over it, breathing hard and trying to understand what had happened to Hirsch. She had died. She was certain of this, as certain as she had ever been of anything in her life. She remembered the moment when everything had gone dark, remembered the feeling of her heart stopping, remembered the final surrender to oblivion. And yet here she was, standing in a room full of alien equipment, with the body of her would-be recycler at her feet. Her hands were shaking, but not from fear. Something was different inside her. Something fundamental had shifted in the space between death and this impossible resurrection. The pain was still there, a constant companion that reminded her of everything the Vethkai had done to her, but it felt distant now, like a memory rather than a present reality. The door to the recycling chamber opened, and 3 Vethkai security guards entered with weapons drawn, their black eyes scanning the room for threats. They found Hilera standing in the center of the chamber, covered in her own blood and very much alive. Impossible. One of them broadcast mentally, the word carrying a flavor of pure disbelief. Hilera did not give them time to process what they were. Seeing, she grabbed the metal tray she had knocked over earlier and swung it at the nearest guard with all her strength. The edge caught the creature across its cluster of eyes, and it screamed with a sound that came through the air rather than the mind, a high-pitched shriek of agony that was almost satisfying to hear. The other 2 guards raised their weapons, but Hilera was already moving, her body responding to commands she did not consciously give. She ducked under the first plasma bolt and drove her shoulder into the second guard's midsection, sending it crashing into the wall. The third guard got off a shot that burned across her ribs, but the pain only made her faster, only made her angrier. She killed them all with her bare hands and with the tools they had intended to use on her dead body. When it was over, she stood in the doorway of the recycling chamber, surrounded by the remains of 4 Vethkai, and she felt nothing but a cold clarity that was entirely new to her. An alarm began to wail throughout the station, and she could hear more guards approaching from somewhere deeper in the ship. She needed to move, needed to find a way off this vessel. But first, she needed to understand what had happened to her. A reflective panel on the wall caught her attention, and she turned to look at her own reflection for the first time since waking. The face that stared back was recognizable but changed. Her features were the same brown hair matted with blood, the same determined jaw, the same nose that had been broken once in training and never healed. Quite straight, but her eyes were wrong. Where they had once been a simple brown, now they held flecks of something golden that seemed to glow with their own inner light. She reached up to touch her face, and her reflection did the same. And she watched those strange new eyes widen with a mixture of wonder and fear. "What did they do to me?" she whispered to her reflection. The reflection had no answers. The sound of approaching guards grew louder, and Hilera pushed her questions aside for later survival first. Understanding second, she grabbed a weapon from one of the fallen guards and checked its charge. Finding it still had plenty of power remaining, the corridors of the Vethkai station twisted and turned in patterns that made no logical sense to human eyes. But Illyra found that she could navigate them anyway. Some new instinct guiding her toward what felt like safety. She encountered 2 more patrols and killed them both before they could raise and alarm her. Body moved with a precision and speed that should have been impossible for someone who had been dead less than an hour ago. But she did not question it, because questioning would slow her down. Finally, she found a small storage room and sealed herself inside. Barricading the door with containers of unknown materials, she needed time to think, time to plan, time to understand what was happening to her. The wounds on her body were not healing, but they were not bleeding either. The pain was present, but manageable. Pushed to the edges of her awareness by that strange new clarity that filled her mind, she sat down in the corner of the room and closed her eyes. Trying to remember the moment of her death, it came back to her in fragments. The final slowing of her heart, the darkness that had swallowed her whole, the sensation of falling into something vast and empty, and then light, golden and warm, wrapping around her like a blanket and pulling her back from wherever she had been going. The door to the storage room shuddered under an impact, and Illyra opened her eyes. More guards had found her. She rose to her feet and checked her stolen weapon one more time, and she felt something that might have been a smile trying to form on her face. "Come on then," she said to the door and to whatever waited on the other side. The door burst open, and the Vethkai poured through, and Illyra met them with fire and fury and the absolute certainty that she had already survived the worst they could do to her. They beat her down eventually, overwhelming her with sheer numbers and stunning her with weapons set to incapacitate rather than kill. As consciousness faded for the second time that day, she heard a familiar voice scraping through her thoughts. "Bring her to me," lead researcher Skethrix commanded. And there was something new in that mental voice, something that sounded almost like excitement. "This specimen has become far more interesting than I anticipated." Illyra let the darkness take her. But this time she was not afraid. She knew now that the darkness was not the end. For her, death had become just another doorway, and she would walk through it as many times as necessary until she found her way home. Illyra felt her heart stop as the electricity coursed through her body, every muscle seizing at once before the final stillness claimed her. The darkness came, familiar now, and she fell into it without fear. 23 minutes later, she opened her eyes to find Skethrix standing over her with those clusters of black eyes fixed on her face like she was the most fascinating thing in the universe. Remarkable. The lead researcher's voice scraped through her mind. "The resurrection time has decreased by 14 minutes. We must determine if this pattern continues." It continued. They killed her on the 3rd day with a toxin that dissolved her organs from the inside, and she returned in 19 minutes with her insides somehow whole again. They killed her on the 4th day by stopping her heart with a precise electrical pulse, and she returned in 15 minutes with a heartbeat stronger than before. Each death changed her in ways that the Vethkai documented with obsessive detail, but could not explain. Her reflexes became faster, sharp enough to catch objects thrown at her before she consciously registered their movement. Her pain tolerance increased until sensations that had made her scream in the beginning barely made her flinch, and her eyes, those strange new eyes with their golden flecks, grew brighter with each resurrection until they seemed to glow softly, even in complete darkness. Skethrix became obsessed with understanding her. The lead researcher spent hours reviewing data, comparing Illyra's biological readings before and after each death, searching for some scientific explanation for the impossible. "Your cellular structure shows no regenerative capabilities," Skethrix told her during one of the rare moments between experiments. Your genetic code contains nothing that would suggest this ability. By every measurement we have, you are an ordinary member of your species. And yet you continue to defy death itself. Alira sat in her reinforced cell, chains binding her wrists and ankles to the wall. And she smiled at the alien with teeth stained by blood from her latest resurrection. Maybe you're measuring the wrong things, she said. Skethrix tilted its head at that familiar, impossible angle. Explain. You look at my body, Alira said, and her voice had changed over the past days, growing quieter and calmer even as the power inside her grew stronger. You study my cells and my blood and my brain, but that's not where it comes from. That's not what brings me back. Then what does? Alira leaned forward as far as her chains would allow, and the golden light in her eyes flared brighter for a moment. I don't know yet, she admitted. But I think it has something to do with the fact that I refuse to stay dead. I think it has something to do with wanting to survive so badly that the universe has no choice but to let me. Skethrix was silent for a long moment, processing this information in whatever way the Vethkai mind processed things. Then the researcher turned and left without another word. That night, Alira heard Skethrix giving orders to access the captured human databases, searching for information about the human spirit, human will, human stories of impossible survival. The researcher was looking for answers in the wrong places. But Alira did not tell it that. Let the Vethkai search through mythology and religion and historical records. They would find stories of humans surviving impossible odds. Soldiers fighting through wounds that should have killed them. Mothers lifting vehicles to save their children. Explorers walking out of disasters that should have claimed them. What they would not find was an explanation, because the truth was that Alira did not understand it either. She only knew that each time she died, she came back stronger, and each time she came back, she was less afraid and more certain of one thing. She was going to destroy them all. The fifth death came on day 6. Skethrix had developed a new theory about the resurrection process and wanted to test it by killing her in a way that destroyed her brain completely. Alira felt the device activate against her skull, felt the burst of energy that should have ended her consciousness forever. The darkness came, but this time, there was something in the darkness with her. She could not see it or hear it, but she felt its presence. Vast and warm and achingly familiar. It felt like every person she had ever loved gathered into one infinite moment of connection. It felt like humanity itself, reaching across the void to pull her back. When she opened her eyes, she was already sitting up on the table, and her resurrection time had dropped to 8 minutes. The Vethkai researchers stumbled backward in shock because they had been preparing to dispose of her body, and suddenly she was there, awake and aware, and watching them with eyes that now burned like molten gold. You don't understand what you're creating, she said to Skethrix in a voice that was calm and quiet and absolutely certain. A lead researcher recovered its composure and moved closer, studying her with renewed intensity. Then tell me, Skethrix demanded, what are you becoming? Alira considered the question. She thought about the warmth in the darkness, about the feeling of connection that pulled her back each time, about the growing power she could feel coiling inside her like a spring being wound tighter and tighter. I used to be afraid of death, she said finally. Everyone is. It's the one thing all living beings share. The fear of ending, the terror of oblivion. She paused, and when she continued, there was something almost like pity in her voice. But you took that fear away from me. You killed me so many times that death lost its power. And now I understand something that your species never will. What is that? Alira smiled. And it was not a human smile anymore. It was something older and fiercer and full of a light that the Vethkai had no name for. Death isn't the end for humans, she said. It's just the door we walk through to become something more. And every time you send me through that door, I come back stronger. I come back faster. I come back more certain that I'm going to be the last thing you ever see." The ninth death came 3 hours later. Skethrix had ordered maximum restraints. Chains and energy fields and physical barriers designed to contain creatures far stronger than any human. But when Alira died and returned this time, something was different. Her wounds began healing while she was still strapped to the table. Flesh knitting together and bones resetting themselves with sounds that made even the Vethkai researchers back away in horror. The restraints that had held her through 8 resurrections suddenly seemed fragile. And when she pulled against them, they began to crack and groan. "Increase the containment fields," Skethrix ordered. But there was something in the researcher's mental voice that had not been there before Fear Alira pulled harder. And the chains shattered. The energy fields flickered and died. The physical barriers bent and broke. She stood in the center of the research chamber, surrounded by the ruins of everything they had used to hold her. And the golden light in her eyes was so bright now that it cast shadows on the walls. "Thank you," she said to Skethrix. And her voice was gentle, almost kind. "Thank you for showing me what I could become." Then she began to walk toward the door. And nothing in the universe could have stopped her. The research station had never experienced anything like Alira Vance. She moved through the corridors like a storm, given human form. Her bare feet leaving bloody prints on the organic floors, and her golden eyes lighting the way. Through the dim passages, the first security team found her within minutes of her escape. From the research chamber, there were 12 of them. Elite Vethkai warriors armed with plasma weapons and armored in chitinous plates that could stop most projectiles. They formed a firing line and opened up with everything they had. Alira ran straight into the barrage. 3 bolts hit her center mass, burning through her flesh and dropping her to the floor. She died for the 10th time, with her hand still reaching toward her enemies. The Vethkai soldiers approached carefully, weapons still trained on her body, confirmed the kill. Their squad leader ordered one of them moved closer, scanning her with a device that measured life signs. "Confirmed," the soldier reported. "No heartbeat, no brain activity. The specimen is terminated." Then Alira's hand shot up and grabbed the soldier by the throat. The resurrection had taken 4 seconds. She pulled herself up using the soldier as leverage. Her wounds already closing as she moved, and she tore through the security team with a speed and ferocity that defied everything they knew about human biology. When it was over, she stood alone in a corridor filled with the fallen, and she picked up one of their plasma rifles and checked its power. Supply plenty of charge remaining good. She continued moving deeper into the station, following an instinct she did not fully understand toward what felt like the heart of the vessel. More security teams came, and she killed them all. They shot her down twice more, but the resurrections were almost instantaneous now, her body rebuilding itself before she hit the ground. By the time she reached the command level, the Vethkai had stopped sending soldiers to stop her. Instead, they had sealed themselves behind blast doors and containment shields, hoping that barriers would succeed where weapons had failed. Alira pressed her palm against the first blast door and felt the metal grow warm beneath her touch. She did not understand the source of the power flowing through her, but she understood how to use it. The door began to glow, then to soften, then to flow like liquid around her hand as she pushed through it on the other side. She found a control room filled with panicking Vethkai officers. They scrambled for weapons, for escape routes, for anything that might save them from the GoldenEye nightmare that had just walked through solid metal. Alira ignored them all and moved to the communication array. Her fingers found the controls with a certainty that surprised her, as if some part of her already knew how Vethkai technology worked. Maybe it was knowledge absorbed from the researchers who had spent so many hours studying her. Maybe it was something else entirely. She opened the channel on human military frequencies, and spoke in a voice that was calm despite everything. "This is Commander Alara Vance of the Terran Reconnaissance Corps. I am being held on a Vethkai research station at the following coordinates." The station's defensive capabilities are minimal. Its crew is approximately 300, and they have been experimenting on captured humans. She paused and looked around at the officers who had frozen in place, watching her with expressions of pure terror. "I recommend immediate strike teams. These beings have information about dozens of human colonies that have disappeared, and they need to answer for what they have done." She ended the human transmission and switched to a frequency she had heard the Vethkai using. "This message is for the Vethkai Dominion," she said, and her voice carried a weight that made the officers in the room shrink back against the walls. "My name is Alara Vance, and I am what you made me. Watch closely, because I want you to see what happens to those who harm humanity." She broadcast the security feeds from around the station, letting Vethkai Command witness the trail of destruction she had carved through their elite forces somewhere in the distance. Alarms began to wail with a new urgency. The station commander, a massive Vethkai whose chitin was scarred from decades of service, appeared on a screen near the communication array. "All personnel evacuate immediately," it ordered. "Self-destruct sequence initiating. This station must not fall into human hands." Alara watched the evacuation begin through the security feeds, saw escape pods launching from docking bays throughout the station, saw the desperate scramble of beings who had once considered themselves the masters of 100 worlds. She did not try to stop them, let them carry stories of what they had seen, let them spread fear through the Dominion. Like a plague, the station shuddered as the self-destruct sequence began its countdown, and Alara turned away from the control room to finish one last piece of business. She found Skethrix hiding in the main research laboratory, surrounded by data drives and sample containers that the researcher was frantically trying to save. The lead researcher froze when Alara entered, those clusters of black eyes fixed on her with an expression that might have been resignation. "You could have run," Alara observed, walking slowly toward the being who had killed her 9 times. "The data is too valuable," Skethrix replied. "What we learned from you could change everything we understand about biological potential. I could not leave it behind." Alara stopped a few feet from the researcher, close enough to kill with a single movement if she chose. "You still don't understand," she said, and there was something almost like sadness in her voice now. "You think what happened to me was biology. You think it was something in my cells or my brain that can be studied and replicated." She reached out and took one of the data drives from Skethrix's ends, examining it briefly before crushing it to powder. "It wasn't biology," she continued. "It was will. It was the refusal to give up. It was every human who ever survived something they shouldn't have survived. Every soldier who kept fighting with mortal wounds. Every parent who lifted impossible weights to save their children. Every explorer who walked out of disasters that should have killed them." She crushed another drive. "We don't survive because our bodies are strong. We survive because something inside us refuses to accept defeat. And when you pushed me past the point of death, you didn't break me." She stepped closer, and Skethrix pressed back against the laboratory wall. "You unlocked something that was always there, waiting for a reason to wake up." The station shuddered again, more violently this time. "You're going to die here," Skethrix said. "The self-destruct will vaporize everything," Alara smiled, and the golden light in her eyes seemed to pulse with amusement. "Maybe," she admitted, "but I think we both know that death isn't much of a threat to me anymore." She turned and walked toward the door, leaving Skethrix amid the ruins of the research that had consumed the scientist's entire career. Then, she stopped and looked back over her shoulder. "You're going to survive," she said. "I saw an escape pod near this section, but hasn't launched yet. you're going to take it. And you're going to deliver a message to your Dominion. What message? Alira's smile widened. And in that moment she looked less like a human and more like something out of humanity's oldest and darkest legends. Tell them we're coming, she said. Tell them that everything they feared about humans was true. And tell them that I am just the first of many. The first of an entire species that you have given a reason to become something more than they ever thought possible. She walked out of the laboratory as the station began its final collapse behind her. Skethrix scrambled for the escape pod ahead of her. The void of space waited with cold patience, and somewhere in the distance, human ships were already burning toward her, signal racing to witness what one of their own had become. The explosion painted the void with light for a brief moment before the darkness swallowed it. All, where the Vethkai research station had been, there was now only debris. Twisted metal and organic components spreading outward in an expanding sphere of destruction. Captain Marcus Chun of the Terran warship, Indomitable, watched the explosion through the bridge view screen. His jaw tight with tension. They had arrived too late. The distress signal from Commander Vance had led them here at maximum speed. But the station had detonated before they could mount a rescue operation. Scan for survivors, he ordered. Though he held little hope, the tactical officer ran sensor sweeps through the debris field while the crew waited in heavy silence. They all knew Alira Vance, knew her reputation as one of the best reconnaissance pilots in the fleet, knew that she had been missing for days with no explanation. Now they knew where she had been, and they had arrived too late to save her. Captain, the tactical officer said suddenly, her voice sharp with disbelief. I'm reading a life sign. Where? In the debris field. Approximately 3 kilometers from the explosion center. Human biosignature. But the readings are strange. Captain. Chun leaned forward in his command chair. Define strange. The life signs keep flickering, dropping to 0 and then returning. I've never seen anything like it. Get a shuttle out there immediately. The rescue shuttle launched within minutes, threading its way through the wreckage with careful precision. What they found floating in the void was Commander Alira Vance, her body exposed to the vacuum of space, ice crystals forming on her skin and her eyes frozen shut. She was dead. Shuttle pilot reported this with a voice thick with grief. Already preparing to bring the body aboard for transport. Home then. Alira's eyes opened. The shuttle crew scrambled backward in shock as she sat up on the rescue platform, coughing out ice crystals and taking her first breath in what their instruments said had been 23 minutes. She looked at the rescue team with eyes that glowed like captured suns, and her voice when she spoke was raw but steady. What took you so long? They brought her back to the Indomitable, and the ship's doctor ran every test available. The results made no sense. Alira's biology was completely human. Number mutations, no enhancements, nothing that should have allowed her to survive explosive decompression and extended vacuum exposure. But there was something different about her that the scans could not capture. Something in the way she moved, and the way she looked at people, and the impossible light that burned in her eyes. The crew kept their distance, unsure whether to treat her as a hero or a monster. Captain Chun came to see her in the medical bay after the initial tests were complete. He stood at the foot of her bed and looked at the young woman, who had once been an ordinary reconnaissance pilot, trying to reconcile what he remembered with what he saw before him. The medical staff are afraid of you, he said quietly. They should be, Alira replied, and there was no arrogance in her voice. Only a strange sort of acceptance. I'm afraid of me too. I don't fully understand what I've become. Can you try to explain it? Alira was silent for a long moment, her golden eyes distant as she searched for words. They killed me, she said finally. 9 times. They killed me in every way they could think of. And every time I came back different, stronger, faster, less afraid. She looked at the captain with an intensity that made him want to step backward. There's something inside humans that we never knew about, something that sleeps until we need it, something that wakes up when we're pushed past the point where we should break. She held up her hand and watched it as if seeing it for the first time. They wanted to understand us, and instead they showed us what we could become, while the Indomitable carried Illyra back toward human space. A single Vethkai escape pod was making its way toward the Dominion homeworld. Skethrix sat in the cramped confines of the pod, surrounded by the few data drives that had survived the researchers' desperate escape. The journey took days, and Skethrix spent every moment reviewing the recordings, watching again and again as a simple human female defied everything the Vethkai understood about biology and death. By the time the pod reached the homeworld, Skethrix had developed a new theory about humanity. It was not a comforting theory. The High Council of the Vethkai Dominion convened in their great chamber, a vast organic space grown from the living tissue of their oldest ancestor, Sketh. Rick stood before the 7 council members and projected the recordings onto the chamber walls. The council watched in silence as a human died and returned, died and returned, died and returned, growing stronger with each resurrection until she tore through their elite forces like they were made of paper. "This is impossible," one of the council members declared. "Human biology contains no mechanism for such regeneration." "You are correct," Skethrix replied. "I examined the specimen in exhaustive detail. There is nothing in human cellular structure or genetic code that explains what we witnessed." "Then how do you explain it?" Skethrix paused, choosing the next words with care. "I believe that humans possess a form of potential that exists outside normal biological parameters, a latent capability that activates under conditions of extreme stress." The researcher brought up comparison data. "Consider the historical records we have gathered from captured human databases. Accounts of individuals surviving injuries that should have been fatal, parents displaying impossible strength to save their offspring, soldiers continuing to fight long after their bodies should have failed." Skethrix let the implications hang in the air. "I believe that what we call death is not the same thing for humans that it is for other species. For them, it may function as a catalyst, a trigger that unlocks abilities which remain dormant under normal circumstances." The council chamber was silent. "What you are suggesting," the eldest council member said slowly, "is that by killing this human repeatedly, you enhanced her capabilities beyond anything we could have achieved through conventional means." "Yes, and every human possesses this same potential." Skethrix displayed the final recording, the moment when Illyra had walked through a solid metal blast door as if it were not there. "Every human is a seed," the researcher said, "and death is the water that makes it grow. We have been fighting a species that has never used its full strength, never needed to, never been pushed hard enough to awaken what sleeps inside them." The recording ended on Illyra's face, those golden eyes burning with impossible light. Until now, the eldest council member leaned forward. "What message did this human send you to deliver?" Skethrix felt something cold settle into the researcher's chest, something that the Vethkai had not experienced in generations. Fear. "She said to tell you that they are coming, that everything we feared about humans was true, and that she is just the first." The council chamber erupted in argument, some members demanding immediate military action, others calling for diplomatic contact, others suggesting retreat to fortified positions. But Skethrix stood silent through the chaos, thinking about the look in Illyra's eyes at the end. She had not been threatening them. She had been making a promise far across the galaxy. Illyra stood at a viewport on the Indomitable, watching the stars stream past as the ship made its way home. Fleet Admiral Reyes had come aboard via shuttle to debrief her personally, and now the old man stood beside her, looking at her reflection in the viewport glass. "The brass wants to study you," he said. "Figure out how to replicate what happened. Create more soldiers like you. Alira continued watching the stars. They can't, she said quietly. It's not something you can manufacture in a laboratory or inject with a syringe. It has to be earned. It has to be suffered for. Then what do we do with you? Alira turned to face the Admiral, and her eyes were so bright now that he had to look away. You let me go back out there, she said. You let me find the colonies they took, the people they experimented on, and you let me show the Dominion what happens when they underestimate humanity. The Admiral was quiet for a long moment. What happened to you on that station? He asked finally. What did you become? Alira turned back to the viewport, to the endless expanse of stars that suddenly seemed less cold and empty than they had before. I don't have a name for it yet, she admitted. But I know this much. I died 11 times on that station. 11 times I fell into the darkness, and 11 times something pulled me back, and every time I came back, I understood a little more about what humans really are. She pressed her hand against the cold glass of the viewport. We're not the strongest species in the galaxy. Not the fastest. Not the most technologically advanced. But we have something that no other species has. What's that? Alira's reflection smiled, and the golden light in her eyes seemed to pulse with something like joy. We refuse to stay dead, she said. We refuse to give up. We refuse to accept that there are things we cannot overcome. And when the universe pushes us down, we get back up stronger than before. She turned one last time to face the Admiral. And in that moment, she did not look like a young reconnaissance pilot anymore. She looked like something ancient and fierce and absolutely unbreakable. They wanted to understand humanity, she said. They wanted to find our weaknesses and exploit them. Her smile widened. Instead, they showed us what we could become when we stopped being afraid. And now they're going to learn what happens when humanity stops holding back. The Indomitable continued its journey.